I never saw Harold angry, even when other colleagues and myself were stressed over administrative problems. For instance, in 1996, 1997, many faculty in our school were distressed as we debated how to deal with the drastic budget cuts by the Minister for Education at that time, Amanda Vanstone. Following one long faculty meeting on the matter, I was really upset. Harold sympathized, but he also made humorous observations while giving assurances that all would be well. I greatly appreciated his calming manner. I mourn his passing and extend deep sympathy to Harold's wife, Kusnor, their children, Zamir, Aslan, Ida, and Zaid, and his sister, Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I would now like to invite the first of our in-person presenters, Dr. John Maxwell, who is also a former student of Harold's from the earlier part of Harold's career at PSC. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to Ed for the opportunity to make some brief and very personal remarks about my long friendship with Harold. I first met Harold Crouch over 50 years ago. In early 1972, Robin and I had arrived in Jakarta to take up an Australian Volunteers Abroad position at Pajajaran University. We were dropped off at a house on a busy corner of Tanah Abang 2, a house well known to many Australian volunteers that seemed to be organised by the late Budi Prasaja, and where we were made welcome. We were not there very long, though, before we headed off to Bandung to begin our volunteer posting, but occasionally returned if we needed somewhere to stay in Jakarta. And I certainly have a very strong picture in my mind of meeting Harold on one of those occasions in a sarong, sitting outside in the sun, reading. But I didn't have the opportunity to really get to know Harold then. That process really began in an unusual way. When I started to work in the late 70s on a biography of a young student activist of the 1960s, something originally intended as a very minor project, Harold's book, The Army and Politics in Indonesia, which Ed has referred to, became for me one of the most significant sources about the world of Indonesian politics during that period, and provided me with that detailed background view to the micro study that I was starting. I reopened my copy recently and was reminded of what a stunning example that work was. The evidence of rigorous field research, interviews with so many of the leading players, a superb example of sustained engagement with the country he was writing about, and just so superbly written. Harold's book remains, as Ed has suggested, as one of the classics of modern Indonesian studies. In 1984, Robin and I had moved to Canberra, and my much interrupted biography project resumed as I became a PhD candidate in the Department of Political and Social Change. As luck would have it, Harold took up a position there as a senior research fellow and joined my panel of supervisors, Herb Feith, Jamie Mackey, and Harold Crouch. What an incredible trifecta, you might think. Well, yes and no. Draft chapters sent down to Herb were rapidly returned, covered in his handwritten comments, paragraphs crossed out or rearranged, those famous green Monash notes attached to various pages with suggestions. Had I thought of this? What about that? Drafts to Jamie were also returned promptly with many critical comments, but sometimes these seemed to run counter to Herb's suggestions. But then there was Harold, a far lighter touch, a minor correction here and there, and always some positive comments at the end, assuring me that I was on the right track and encouraging me to press on. What a relief. With Jamie's retirement, it was Harold who arranged the external examiners and shepherded the process through the university bureaucracy to a successful conclusion, something which I remain immensely grateful for. In 2000 and 2001, Harold and I were both once again living and working in Jakarta. Harold is the director of the International Crisis Group, while I was working with a group of Indonesian researchers following the impact of the Asian financial crisis, establishing an applied poverty research institute, now known widely as SMERU. Our friendship was strengthened over occasional dinners together at the apartment that Harold and Kusnor occupied across the other side of town. And then after his retirement from ANU, when Harold was working in Banda Aceh as the director of the Aceh Research Training Institute, he invited me to prepare and deliver one of the short training programs for the group of junior university researchers that ARTI was assisting. I spent several busy weeks staying with Harold and Kusnor in Banda Aceh, accompanied briefly by two of my SMERU research colleagues. After our move back to Melbourne in 2012, Harold and Kusnor made occasional trips down to Melbourne, where we joined up to visit old friends, in particular, Professor John Legg, who had been Kusnor's mentor for postgraduate studies at Monash, as well as Arif and Leila Budiman. Arif by then retired from Melbourne University and in poor health. And whenever I made regular visits back to Canberra from Melbourne in recent years, I always made a point of calling at Harold and Kusnor's home in Dry Street. And I certainly found it distressing to see the impact of Harold's long battle with serious illness, which seemed to grow worse with every visit I made. But I will always remember Harold as a kind and generous friend and one of the giants of Indonesian and Southeast Asian studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And our third speaker will be Sydney Jones, who I'm not sure if she's in Jakarta or in New York or some other distant place, but Sydney worked closely with Harold for many years and replaced him as the director of the International Crisis Group in Jakarta. Sydney, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. I'm here in Brooklyn, and I was thinking about how I got to know Harold at two different periods. One was when I was a visiting fellow at ANU in 1995, where I met many of you. And the second time was when I replaced Harold as director of the International Crisis Group in Jakarta. You may not believe this, but at one time I was terrified of academics because I was always afraid they would be intimidating or that they would engage me in unintelligible conversation. And I remember when I came to ANU and I took my first report on migration to Malaysia, on Indonesian migration to Malaysia, and I knocked at Harold's door, and he could not have been more helpful, more friendly, more accommodating. And it was just wonderful. And I knew we'd become friends when at one point there was a PhD presentation, a proposal presentation, and Harold called me up and wanted reinforcements for the area studies side against the postmodernists at ANU. And I knew we were going to be firm friends thereafter. And then when I resigned from Human Rights Watch in December 2001, not knowing what I was going to do next, I wrote to Harold and offered to do one or two papers for ICG at the time, thinking that I could at least use this to tide myself over for a while. And he wrote back immediately saying that he had to return to ANU and would I like his job. So that was the beginning of the next phase in my career. And I went to Jakarta, and Harold couldn't have been more generous in introducing me to his network, which was huge. He had friends across the political spectrum that he had relied on for those wonderful early ICG reports. And I just owed an immense amount to him. His word was enough to open doors across Jakarta and across Indonesia and then across Malaysia when I started going there as well. The downside of this was that he bequeathed to me no files of any kind and an office manager who was so incompetent that Harold would hide from her rather than confront her. But nevertheless, I'm forever grateful to Harold for giving me one of the best jobs I ever had and for being a friend who never expected gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Marcus Mietzner, also a student of Harold's and now, of course, a staff member in the Department of Political and Social Change. And Marcus is speaking to us from Jakarta.
Thank you very much. And the first thing for me, of course, to say is that I regret not being with you in Canberra at the moment. I had to return to Jakarta to continue a project on the Jokowi presidency, which involves interviews with the president. And I take comfort in the fact that I know exactly what Harold would have said. He would have said, don't be silly. It's fine. Go do the work. That's what we're all here for. And he would have been, I think, very curious about hearing the results of that research. And that got me thinking in the last few days about how Harold influenced my approach to Indonesian politics and more generally what it means to be a member of the Harold Crouch School of Indonesian Politics. What does it mean to have been a student of Harold's? I came to Australia in 1997 from Germany, where I had studied Indonesian politics from afar, and I've used an approach that is still being used quite a lot across the world. That means reading newspapers about Indonesia, reading everything that is available, then coming every once in a while to Indonesia, meeting up with academics and chatting about what is happening. But when I came to Australia, Harold, and of course I knew that from his major work, he said, no, we need to go beyond this. We need to actually meet these people. We need to get a sense of who the actors are, what are they motivated by, what drives them, and what kind of environment are they acting. And we only understand that really if we get to meet them, if we try at least to understand them. Now, that of course means we'll get a lot of self-serving accounts during the interviews and so forth, but still there's no substitute for direct engagement with the actors. And Ed mentioned earlier on the 70 or so interviews that are now available in the archives because of that approach of Harold's. Of course, that often comes with a downside, and again, that is sort of part of the particular ANU brand over the years, that there have been critics that say, you know, ANU has been too close to power. ANU has been in this attempt to try to understand the people who hold power in Indonesia has been become too close. But Harold has taught us how we can get close to people, how we can interview them, how we can engage with them while still maintaining a very critical, a very analytical, and a very scholarly approach to our subjects. And so in the last few days, again, when I did my own work here, meeting President Jokowi and others, I constantly reminded myself of this sort of premise of Harold's research. Yes, talk to them, but always keep in mind, you know, what kind of people you are meeting, what the power interests are that drive them, and so forth. So I'm very proud of being part of that tradition that Harold has established. On that note, Jun Honna, who is also a student of Harold's from Japan, we studied at about the same time. He is also, it's a long story, but he's also writing a book on President Jokowi, also asked by the president in a parallel project. He can't be here with us today. So he asked me to just read out his message. And I warn you from the beginning, it's very sweet. So I hope I get through this. Dear Harold, I clearly remember my first day in Canberra as a PhD student. You kindly picked me up at the Canberra airport and showed me around the ANU campus. I was so impressed by your kindness and frankness. I was really lucky to have such a friendly supervisor like you. Harold, you were the author of the book I first read on Indonesia, and I aspire to be a scholar like you. Thank you for your time with me in Canberra and Jakarta. I will really miss you, Harold, but you will live on eternally in my heart. I wish you a peaceful rest. And I'll finish with that because I think I can't say it any better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and also to Jun Hana for those very heartfelt remarks about Ben. Our next speaker is from Malaysia, currently in KL, Dr. Marzuki Muhammad, who was a student of Harold's and in his subsequent career went on to rise to very high levels within Malaysian politics, including being a former principal private secretary to Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin. So thank you, Pak Marzuki.
Thank you, Greg. Back in 2003, I was looking for a university to pursue my PhD in political science, and ANU was on my list. It was closer to home compared to universities in the UK or the US, and the exchange rate was not too bad then. So I wrote an email to Harold asking him whether he would be willing to be my supervisor. He was the author of Government and Society in Malaysia, a renowned scholar, and a professor at a prestigious university. This combination of a good university and a great professor looks perfect to me. A few days later, he wrote back to me and he said yes. He advised me to submit a formal application, which I did, and the rest was history. I arrived in Canberra in December 2003, and that was the first time I set foot on a foreign land. I met Harold for the first time. He was a very humble and kind person. I called him Professor, and he said, no, you just call me Harold. Coming from a conservative Malay family with a strong Asian tradition, that was quite a culture shock to me. Out of respect, we do not call our teachers by their name. We call them Professor, Doctor, or even Sir. Now, Harold broke that cultural barrier for me. Then I started writing my thesis. It was about communal politics, law, and political control in Malaysia. Back at home, Malay youth were inspired by the Reformasi movement that started a few years earlier. And I was writing something on the use of law, courts, and the apparatuses of the state as political tools to silence dissent and persecute political opponents. Of course, as a young man then, I was a bit robust in my thinking and writings. Sometimes I got carried away with my anti-establishment nature as a young man. I used strong words and made some judgmental observations about politics, democracy, human rights that are not all suitable for academic writing. Now, Harold gave me a very useful piece of advice that I vividly remember until today. He said, Marzuki, you must be sophisticated in your writing. Don't use strong words and avoid being judgmental. Malaysians are very kind people, and don't be un-Malaysianist. Now, Harold's words of wisdom struck me like a lightning bolt. For a moment, I thought Harold was more Malaysian than me. Not only did he understand Malaysian politics more than I do, He also embraced the values of Malaysian culture and tradition. Perhaps a decade of living and working in Malaysia and married to a lovely Malay lady and historian, Puan Kasno, made him a true Malaysianist. After 4 years of writing my thesis under his supervision and Greg as my co-supervisor, I completed my PhD in 2007. I continued to get in touch with Harold after that. He and Puan Kasno came to Malaysia a few times, and I visited them at their home in Petaling Jaya. I also visited ANU a few times in my personal and official capacity, including to speak at Malaysia Update Forum in 2012. Harold made efforts to attend the event, even though he was not well. The last time I visited him was in February this year. He could not recognize me anymore. I was sad. I was very sad. And standing by his bed, I made prayer to God that he will give his mercy to this great man who was very kind to me and loved by students, friends, and family. One day, John texted me to inform me that Harold had passed away. I was heartbroken, but I took consolation that he left us for heavenly abode. I believe Harold's passing left a void no one else can fill, and he will be sorely missed by all of us. I convey my deepest condolence to Puan Kasno, her children, grandchildren, and family members. As a Muslim, on this Friday morning, I pray that Allah shower His mercy upon him and grant him Jannah. Ameen, Ameen, Ya Rabbal Alameen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Marzuki. Ben mentioned in his remarks that Harold had students from across much of Asia, and he had several students, in fact, from Japan. We heard briefly from one of those students, Jun Honna, just before, but we'll now have the chance to hear from another, Associate Professor Kikwai Hamayotsu, who's one of Harold's students who studied both Malaysia and Indonesia. And Kikwai is an academic at the Northern Illinois University in the US. Thank you, Kikwai.
Hi, everyone. Have not seen you all so many years. I was weeping when I was preparing for this small remark, so I tried to be cheerful as I want him to remember me. So first, I'd like to thank Ed, Ben, and Sana, who should be there, for contacting me personally to inform me about Harold has just passed away, knowing that he meant a lot for me personally and for my academic career up to today. Now I have this brief moment, remind me 5 minutes, to share my fond memory and a happy episode with and about Harold. I'm now in Chicago, enjoying my academic career mostly and always, but the lovely, happy life I have built since I left NU. All those wonderful things would not have been really possible without Harold and me pursuing him, study and work with me there in Canberra almost some 20 years ago. So first, let me highlight two professional episodes and impact Harold had on me and for my academic career, one on scholarship and another on teaching. So when I heard from Ed about Harold passing, I was just reading a new book on Malaysia, a lecture reform and democracy, published very fresh in 2023. To write in a book review, I was just requested. So in this new book, I immediately noticed Harold's name and one of his many works published in 1996. I think this small episode exemplifies one of the most important things I have learned from Harold to develop and cultivate my own scholarship. during one of my regular conversation with him in his old office in a Kummus building, which I enjoyed very much when I was in Canberra, he told me that we do research and write something solid and it will last a long time. And doing research is just like in a building house where you like to live. So it may not be grand nor flashy on the surface, but it is well structured and built so carefully and meticulously and solid that will last for a long time. So this has become, I think, one of the philosophical foundation of my comparative research, the kind of empirical research I would like to continue doing up to today. And then second on a teaching, I only guess that many of us know that graduate education and training is a very personal experience, as we have already heard. It is essential, I learned, to build a trustworthy and a comfortable working relationship with our students. I personally find it extremely difficult, maybe because of my personalities. And so I have to invest a lot of emotional energy and a conscious effort to build such a relationship to mentor student, the kind of nice relationship which I have built with Harold. As Ed Aspinall beautifully described in his obituary, Harold was the best teacher and supervisor and a mentor I could ask for. Retrospectively speaking, Harold's personalities did work very well for somebody like me. I was very ambitious and very driven and almost single-minded, little rebellious in many ways in pursuing my professional goals when I was still a young student. I wish I could regain the energy which I used to have to continue working in the future. But Harold gave me a significant amount of intellectual autonomy and flexibility and abundant and generous support and understanding, which I needed to cultivate my own independent study identity and a confidence so I could stand and thrive on my own feet far beyond my graduate education and departure from ANU. So finally, I'd like to mention a little bit more personal episode. I like to refresh all our memory that Harold taught and trained many young female students from all over the world at NU, including Indonesia and Japan and etc. So I'm only one of them. When we are young graduate students at Canberra, there was no such thing as the Me Too movement or a little discussion about gender parity or diversity or mentoring for women or men of color. Again, I was blessed to have Harold as my mentor and supervisor, and also grateful for Ben as the head of the department at the time. I was surrounded by tight network, so-called Harold boys, and few of you are seeing here, who were already thriving, actively producing ahead of me and around me. So I needed to search my own voice and somehow establish some level of professional recognition in such a competitive environment. So as all of you probably remember, Harold was such a gentleman. I and other female students often attempted and even competed with one another to meet with him over lunch or dinner when we are in the field, Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur, to penetrate the boys' network. Harold, however, did decline to meet with any one of us, at least myself, and on our own outside of his own office, because he said, Kasna would not like it. So here is another professional obstacle, but a lovely kind of episode I remember about Harold and Kasna as a lovely and admirable couple I cherish and adored very much till today. So I am very forever grateful for his and Kasna's support for my career and professional personal development, and for other colleagues and friends in this small community we are now building together to cherish and live his legacy, hopefully in many years to come. Thank you so much, and thank you for attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kikwe. And now our final speaker is also someone present here, Dr. Eve Warburton from the Department of Political and Social Change. And Eve worked with Harold when he was director at the Aceh Research Training Institute. So thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Greg. I first met Harold, as has been referenced a few times now, in 2008 when I joined ARTI, the Aceh Research Training Institute. This was a wonderful initiative organised through a consortium of Australian universities led by Professor Michael Lee, who's here today. And we trained Achenese lecturers in research methods. Harold was the director and I was the program manager. And I was very green. I was in my early 20s. I was pretty fresh from my undergraduate studies, in fact. It was my first time living in Aceh. And it was my first time, of course, meeting this eminent scholar whose work I had become very familiar with in my undergraduate degree. I'd taken courses in Southeast Asian politics at Sydney Uni, taught, in fact, by Ed. And so I knew of Harold. I was very nervous and intimidated. But of course, as we've heard from other people speaking today, he was nothing like I had imagined one of the biggest names in Asia's political science community would be. He was infinitely humble, generous with his time, quietly spoken, but with a very surprising and wicked sense of humour. In fact, I often left his office after a meeting with tears in my eyes, not because I was upset, but because I'd been cacking myself at some jokes he'd been making. But Harold never treated me like I was the green undergraduate I felt I was. To be sure, he and everyone will not be surprised at this. He relied on me for every administrative aspect of the program, but he also gently, with very little fanfare, as though it was the most obvious thing to do, supported me and put me forward to be involved in the intellectual aspects of the project as well. He never behaved like a boss. In fact, he was quite allergic to hierarchy and uncomfortable with deference. He treated me and everyone in our office as equals, despite what were the very yawning gaps in our age and our professional experience. Harold brought so many wonderful Australian scholars to Aceh to participate. And in fact, this is how I met many of the people in the room today, through Harold. And people came to Banda Aceh because they respected and admired him. They all jumped at the chance to come to Aceh and to collaborate with Harold. So it was a wonderful program and very successful. But our office in Aceh was not always a peaceful place. There were, I recall, sort of mini wars breaking out between our secretary, our office driver, between the library assistants over a boyfriend that they had shared. Budgets, I was always paranoid about a budget not balancing or a salary being renegotiated. So I felt that at times our office was rather a chaotic place. But amongst all this chaos, Harold's office was an oasis of calm. Whatever problem I came to him with, and I can relate to Ben's comments on this, he would just shrug, smile, tell me nothing was as big a deal as I thought it was. And if I ever came to him with a mistake that I had made, and I made many mistakes, he would say to me, and this is where I first learnt my favourite Indonesian phrase, oh well, nasi sudah jadi bubur. Nothing you can do about it, move on. And I never saw Harold utter a word in anger. So he wasn't really bothered with administrative woes. In fact, the only task that Harold truly cared about and that he dedicated himself to fully was the work of our Achenese scholars. I was in awe of his patience and his commitment to the core purpose of our work there. He was constantly surrounded by piles of paper, all of the papers that were being written by the scholars who came through our program, and there were many. And he had notes scribbled in the margins, and in fact, I could see that he'd read every word because he was correcting their written Bahasa. Such was his command of Bahasa. And I had this very strong visual memory of, at the end of our 2 years together in Aceh in his office looked exactly the same on the day he left as the day he walked in. There were no pictures, no trinkets, there was no sign of, his sort of personal affectations or anything like this. It was just piles of paper. And I feel like his office mirrored the way that his mind worked. He had this razor-sharp focus on the substance of his research and the research of his students, and everything else was just superfluous clutter, like administration. The final memory I want to share is of the time I spent in Aceh with Harold and Kasnor. Almost every Sunday, I would go to their home. Kasnor would make fresh homemade bread. It was amazing. We'd have lunch or just a cup of tea, but I would spend hours there, and I truly treasured this time in their home. I loved being around them. Their interactions revealed, I think, a very rare mutual respect and adoration. Together, they created this domestic atmosphere of warmth and calm, and they became my family in Aceh. And in fact, they continued to be my family in Canberra for many years to come. I would come here to work with Ed, or in the early days of my PhD research, when I visited Canberra, they would open up their home and host me, and I would stay with them. But then, of course, over the years, our lives became very busy. Kasnor's life and Harold's life became busy with their growing grandchildren, Ida's children. I got married, I traveled a lot, I spent a lot of time in Sydney, but each time I returned to visit them, it always felt like I was coming home. I'm so grateful to have known Harold, and I'm so grateful to have spent time with Harold and Kasnor, and I wish to thank them for their kindness, their wise words over the years, and for showing me and so many others what it truly looks like to commit oneself to work, love, and family.
Thank you very much, Eve. And indeed, thank you to all the speakers for sharing your memories and reflections about Harold. It's been very moving to hear the depth of admiration and also affection for Harold. And I hope that this event has given us an opportunity to reflect on the deep impact that Harold had on our lives and our academic work. The recollections of today's speakers have beautifully underscored just how kind, thoughtful, obliging, and also funny Harold could be. We will miss him very much, but we will savour all of these memories that we have of him.